Hey guys, this is Matthew Lilly. Today is episode 100 of the Presence Pioneers podcast, and I have a couple of major announcements to make today. In a few minutes, I'm going to jump on with David Bradshaw, the founder of Awaken the Dawn, and we're going to be sharing about a brand new podcast that we are launching together, and I'm really excited about it. If you've loved Presence Pioneers podcast, you are going to love this new podcast that we are launching together with Awaken the Dawn. But I also wanted to let you know, in light of that my wife and I have been praying, and we feel like the season of the Presence Pioneers podcast has come to an end. And so we are going to allow episode 100 to be our grand finale and to be our final episode of this podcast. You know, I launched this podcast over 3 years ago, and my original desire was simply to share some of my teachings, some of my practical trainings with leaders, friends, intercessors, prayer missionaries, worship leaders that I was connected with around the world and around our nation. And I've been so honored to be able to release this content. I've been blown away with how God has used it. I began to introduce interviews to the podcast as well with prayer leaders, ministry leaders from around the world. And those have been a lot of fun as well. And, you know, we've probably averaged, just to give you a little behind the scenes look at the podcast, we've probably had an average of 400 or 500 downloads per episode over the course of the 3 years. For some people, that may not seem like a lot. For some people, it does seem like a lot. But I'm personally blown away with, you know, not being someone who's super well known, not having a major platform, our ministry of Presence Pioneers being very small, how God has used this to be able to touch 400 or 500 people every week with teaching, training, Bible, encouragement, resources to strengthen the global day and night worship and prayer movement. That's been my heart and my desire from the very beginning. However, it is a new season. I've recently taken on a part-time staff position at our local church, helping to cultivate prayer there at the church as the prayer coordinator. And we are building a prayer room there at our church. And so that's taking my attention, as well as my role as a prayer missionary with Awaken the Dawn and my staff role there that I'm continuing in this season. And I just feel like the Lord is saying for me and for our family to really zero in on those 2 points of emphasis. And so for us, that means the ending of this Presence Pioneers podcast, but we are launching a new podcast. And so I'm excited to introduce that to you with David Bradshaw in just a few moments. Just wanted to let you know all 100 episodes are going to continue to be online on the audio version, on all the podcast apps, as well as on YouTube. So God could continue to use these to encourage people and strengthen people. Hopefully people will find them as they do Google searches and YouTube searches, and they can continue to be used by God. And so I'm excited about that. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been a listener, a watcher, a supporter, prayed for us, given to us, shared the episodes. So thankful to our Presence Pioneers podcast community. You guys are so amazing. And thank you again. This has been such a fun journey. And actually, I believe the best is yet to come. So check out my conversation here with David Bradshaw. Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. I'm here with David Bradshaw, the founder and director of Awaken the Dawn. David, welcome back to the Presence Pioneers podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. I actually went back and looked up when you were on the podcast before, and it was March of 2020 when we released the original episodes. Yeah, it's been a couple years, and it was also right before COVID, and so the world's changed quite a bit since then.
Yes. Oh, that's true.
But it's been a crazy couple years. But we have an exciting announcement to share with everyone today about a brand new podcast that's launching. So be sure to listen to this whole few minutes here so that we can tell you all about the new podcast that we're launching together with Awaken the Dawn. I'm really excited about this. You know, people can go back and listen to those previous episodes where you share your story about your community in Fredericksburg and the birthing of Awaken the Dawn. But maybe do you want to just give like a minute or two about what Awaken the Dawn is, just in case
Sure.
there's some people that haven't heard those.
Yeah, well, Awaken the Dawn it was birthed in 2017 on the National Mall. We had about 1,700 worship teams. Just a really, quite honestly, a supernatural storyline. Getting there, but the big outcome of that moment, it was 58 tents with 1,700 worship teams, 24 hours a day, and just a real catalytic time. But really what's in our heart was, since then, a couple of things. The big one being this idea in God's heart of public gatherings of 24-hour worship and prayer, hosting Jesus' presence in our cities, campuses, and regions with John 17 unity across those environments. Like that blueprint has just struck our hearts, seeing it from Genesis to Revelation, seeing it in David's Tabernacle and 3,000 years ago with thousands of musicians and the presence of God at the center of Israel, seeing it in heaven, where literally around God's throne, the elders have instruments, there's 24-hour worship. It's this adoration, this tenacious hunger and love for God that just comes out of people's hearts, and he responds to it, and he does stuff, and he releases power in that environment. So, seeing it in history, seeing it in the book of Acts. So that is our passion, is to serve communities, hosting God's presence, coming together in John 17 unity, and round the clock or expressions of radical worship and prayer and love for Jesus, and just that storyline of God that he's writing on the earth. That's our passion, to serve them and see tents go up across America through Tent America. Just thousands of tents is what we're leaning in for, public gatherings of worship around the clock and gospel proclamation. So, we're just excited about the future.
Yeah, amazing. And since you were on the podcast last time, you wrote a book that I have here called Awaken the Dawn. It tells the whole story. Obviously, that would be a number of podcast episodes to go through the entire story. But we're going to link to the book in the podcast description so everybody can get a copy of that and catch up with some of the details, because there's so many miraculous, supernatural things that have happened through the Awaken the Dawn movement. And you guys can also go back and check out episodes 27 and 28 and hear some of the story there from David. I think most of you guys who are tracking with me know that I'm on staff with Awaken the Dawn. But I started this podcast actually over 3 years ago, before I was even officially with ATD. And so over the last couple of years, I've been running David with you guys, and we've been moving together, but I've kind of had this podcast thing on the side happening which has been awesome, and God's used it in amazing ways. But we've just started having some conversations about how can we synergize some of what we're doing together. And so out of that conversation, we've decided to launch a new podcast called the Jesus Movement Podcast, which I'm super excited about, through Awaken the Dawn. And so we're going to be having long-form interviews, conversations together, much of like what we've been doing on the Presence Pioneers podcast. We're moving all that to this new podcast, the Jesus Movement Podcast, which is going to be presented by Awaken the Dawn. And we're going to continue the conversation in this new platform, in this new way. And I'm really excited about it. How are you feeling, David?
I'm so excited. I just really think, Matthew, that this is going to be a key for a couple things. One, for those that want to be in the storyline, you want to have your faith, your heart energized with what is Jesus doing on the earth. Because Jesus has a movement that started thousands of years ago. It's the most powerful movement that has ever existed. It's guaranteed to win, and it's full of this dimension of his activity, of things we could never produce. And the amazing thing is that we're in the story. Literally in the story, in this eternal narrative. Our name is in it. Our yes to him matters. And we want you to fulfill your destiny, your part in the story. And this podcast is what it's going to do is it's going to be an on-ramp into the story of Jesus and the testimonies. And then secondly, just amazing content, because we're going to have some of the most amazing pioneers on this podcast. I know some of them that have already begun recording them, and many others that are coming. Some of the most premier and amazing pioneers in the Jesus movement, in worship, prayer, and gospel proclamation, and from all over
Yes.
the world, all over the nation. They're going to be on this podcast, and the training, the resource that's going to give you. So not only is it the story and the faith and getting inspired, but it's also going to be some amazing teaching and training and just wisdom, I guess, for anybody that watches from some of the premier pioneers of spiritual awakening in our nation and the nations. And so I am so excited about this new podcast, the Jesus Movement podcast. I think it's going to be a resource, not just for Awaken the Dawn. I mean, like you said, I've heard you say a number of times, it's not just the Awaken the Dawn podcast. It's the Jesus. We called it Jesus Movement because this is way bigger than any one organization. And we just want to begin to bring in some of these voices. So follow that new podcast. I really think it will help you fulfill what God's called you to do and just boost like excitement, faith, and with the testimonies and the stories, and then just all kinds of wisdom of how we walk this out for those that are leading in your own sphere. So, yeah, I'm just so excited.
Yeah, me too. Just so you guys know, right from the beginning, we're going to have an interview with Misty Edwards from IHOP in Kansas City and Michael Miller, who's the founder of Upper Room in Dallas. They're going to be released on the very first day. And by the time you hear this, they'll be out. And so you can go find those interviews right now and check those out. And we've got a lot more lined up on the way. Not only some of these amazing leaders of large ministries and movements that are friends of ours, but one of the things we were just talking about this earlier, David, is through Awaken the Dawn, God has connected us to this amazing family all over America.
Yes.
And some of them are small groups, some of them are hidden, but they're having a huge impact on their cities. And God's doing amazing things in kind of a grassroots way. And a lot of people just don't even realize it's going on. And so what we want to do is we want to kind of highlight some of these stories from our ATD network and our friends of other ministries and movements and say, look at what God is doing all over America. You can see the same thing in your life, in your city, in your ministry. Let's glean from what God's doing all over the nation so that we can see Jesus transform America in a profound way. And so we're going to have some people you've heard of and some people you've never heard of before. And I'm actually excited about both of those things.
Yeah. Our heart is just to give you all a front row seat, the best we can, to what Jesus is really doing, the real deal. And then the wisdom and the faith to walk out what he's called you to do. And this is not, a hype up podcast type. That I really believe in this, Matthew. This is going to help a lot of people because the real move of God is you. It's you and me, this weak, normal people. That's where God's actually going to move. And it's not just the big stages, the big ministries. And I think our heart so much is to empower the voices of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that their voice matters as much as the person on the stage. And I think that this podcast will be a resource. I think all kinds of just wisdom and understanding and insight and stories and testimonies that will really inspire and help.
Yeah, totally. So excited. It's going to be available on all the major podcast apps. It's going to be on the Awaken the Dawn YouTube channel, so you can watch the video version. You can always go to awakenthedawn.com and check out the podcast through the ATD website, as well as everything else that's going on with Awaken the Dawn. I'm going to be hosting most of the episodes along with some friends. David's going to be on a lot of the episodes. Some of our other ATD team are going to be involved as well. It's going to be awesome and a whole lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. It's been so great to host the Presence Pioneers podcast. It's been an amazing season.
Great job, by the way. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. 100 episodes. They're going to continue to be online as a resource to people if anybody wants to find them. But I'm also excited about the new season as well and the new stuff that God's doing. I always sign off the Presence Pioneers podcast by saying God's presence changes everything. Interestingly, Awaken the Dawn, our tagline is Jesus changes everything. And we were talking earlier, you were talking, David, earlier when we were chatting, and you were saying that the presence of Jesus is Jesus.
Yes.
So it's the same thing.
Yes, same thing.
Jesus changes everything. God's presence changes everything because Jesus is God and his presence is his person. So be sure to follow along with the Jesus Movement podcast and bless you guys. Don't forget that God's presence changes everything.